November 20th, 1996, Chicago buried Cardinal Bernardine. We have lived through his illness, and we all felt very, very close to him. He taught us how to live, and he taught us how to die. And we felt a tremendous void. School children watched it on TV. Some of us were in Holy Name Cathedral, and everybody watched it on the news. And then, as we always do when we lose someone, we selfishly say, what about me? And our thoughts went to, well, who's going to take his place? Who can fill these shoes? Who would want to take his place? I mean, the tremendous challenge is there, but to come and replace Cardinal Bernardine, an impossible job. And then, on April 8th, 1996, just 4.5 months later, Pope John Paul II appointed Francis George the 8th Archbishop of Chicago, the first time a native Chicagoan held this position. Most of us didn't know Cardinal George. We certainly didn't know what he was going to do. And while we were waiting, Vita and I, my wife, went to New Orleans for a long weekend, and we went to Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, and the OMIs had staffed the St. Louis Cathedral for years, and Bishop George had run their organization, and the priest that said Mass was a member of the Oblates. And after Mass, Vita and I stayed behind a few minutes, and we talked to him, and we told him we were from Chicago, and he said, and I thought this was very profound, he said, I hope Chicago isn't looking for the second coming of Cardinal Bernardine and enjoys the first coming of Cardinal George. And I thought that he said it all. And when I thought of the leadership that we've had in Chicago over the years, I realized after reading His Eminence's bio, which I asked Jay to put on all of the seats, and I really hope you'll read it and take it home with you and share it, that this was the right man at the right time and the man for the moment. No one could have foreseen the problems that would exist in the church in a few years. But if you ever had to pick someone to deal with the crisis that we have, you would have selected Francis George. He has all the attributes that are needed at this time. He's a leader who leads by example. He's firm, yet he's fair and compassionate. He has the utmost integrity. He's honest and he's forthright. And yes, sometimes his candor has caused him some problems. But that's his strength. His strength really is what you see is what you get. He tells it like it is. There's not a phony bone in his body. And he plays by the rules. And when he came back from Dallas, as difficult as it was, he implemented the decisions and the policies that were adopted in Dallas. And he was one of the few who had the courage to tell his brother bishops that they had to be accountable, not only in the future, but in the past. And since he's returned, he spent a great deal of time with the priests and in the churches of the archdiocese, carrying one message: I can't do it alone. We have to heal, and we have to do it together. Your Eminence, we have great confidence in you. We support you. We believe in you, and we'll do anything that we possibly can to help you. It's my pleasure to introduce the Archbishop of Chicago, Francis Cardinal George.
Thank you very much. That's an open invitation at the end that you'll live to regret, probably, Tom Donovan, but I appreciate it nonetheless. There's a book that was reviewed in the book review section of the the Tribune, I think, last Sunday. A current book on a very old figure, Cicero. And I haven't read the book, but I enjoyed the review. And I had some acquaintance with Cicero because doing high school Latin, we used to have to memorize his orations against Catiline, one of his political enemies. Cicero was a great orator, a rhetorician. He was Roman senator for many years, and for several years a consul, which meant that he ran Rome. At that moment when it was transferring its form of government from being an aristocratic republic to being an empire. And in the end, he backed the wrong horse and was, of course, proscripted. He was killed. But in his political discourses that we used to have to memorize, against his enemies, there was a rhetorical ploy that Cicero often used. He would start out orating against Catiline as an enemy of the city, saying that, of course, Catiline, I will not say, and then he'd mention all the things that Catiline was guilty of and why people should turn against Catiline and destroy him, which they finally did. But instead, I will talk about, and then he'd mention very few good things. But 90% of what he was saying was, of course, what he said he wouldn't say. When I was invited, I was asked to speak about the Catholic Church in the fabric of society here in the city and in Cook County and also in Lake County, which is part of the Archdiocese of Chicago. And now I suppose that I can't do that without primarily addressing the current scandal which affects our lives in the church and therefore to some extent also certainly affects the society. But like Cicero, I will tell you in just a few minutes what I wasn't going to talk about, or what I was going to talk about, what I won't talk about now, just to try to locate even the contemporary scope of the difficulties we find ourselves in. The Archdiocese of Chicago, as I mentioned, is 2 counties in northeastern Illinois, Cook and Lake. In those 2 counties, we count perhaps 2.5 million, 2.4 million baptized Catholics, but only about a third of them practice their faith with any kind of regularity. Of that 2.5 million, about a third are now Hispanic, mostly Mexican, about 65%, 30% Puerto Rican, and another 5 to 10% from other Spanish-speaking countries. And that immigration, while it began in the 20s, really, has taken on new scope in the last 20 years. 4% of Catholics are African Americans, 4% are Asians. That too, with more recent immigration from Vietnam and the Philippines particularly. 60-some%, therefore, are non-Hispanic whites. The older groups are Eastern and German and Italian, as they are in many urban areas of the country, but also in Chicago. From the beginning, there have been large numbers of Eastern Europeans, particularly Poles, but Slovaks and Hungarians and others who are Catholic here. Consequently, in recent years, particularly as we moved away from the ethnic parishes that identified neighborhoods and moved towards one parish for each area, we have parishes now which are within their own life multicultural, so the pastor has to be familiar in some sense not only with English but also with Spanish and with Polish. In those parishes, of course, what the church does is worship God as he wants to be worshiped and preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ as it has come down to us from the apostles. But in doing that, in a society, the church necessarily reaches out in numerous ways that affect the life of her own members and affect the life of everyone else as well. And so I had prepared a talk where I was going to put out in some detail, but now won't, the church's efforts in education at all levels, from preschool through university and graduate school, in housing, which particularly for elderly people, the Archdiocese is much involved in race relations and the problem of racism, the original sin of American society, in addressing poverty, particularly through social services available largely through Catholic charities and their organizations, but not only that. In the question of crime and violence on our streets, Chicago has more murders in the last 2 years than any other city, no matter its size, in this country. The proportion of people who are killed violently in Chicago is about the same up to this point as in the Middle East. That is something that we don't often think about, but it is very much part of our civic life, of our societal fabric. And finally, community development through our Justice and Peace Office downtown and also in other ways. The church, however, is not primarily a provider of services. It's a school of discipleship. And in that following of Christ, in being disciples, we are constantly sinners as well as saints. And so I'd like to talk to the current scandal, which comes from the sin of the sexual abuse of minors on the part of some priests and the refusal to deal with it adequately on the part of a few bishops. And then we can open it up for questions, either about all those areas that I was going to talk about but won't, or about what you're really interested in hearing, which is what I'll talk about now. A decade ago, in around 1990, a number of cases of conduct that was both shameful and sinful came forward when victims of sexual abuse by priests, generally in the 60s and 70s and 80s, was made public. This sinful and shameful conduct was, in most cases, no longer criminal. And that because, as you know, the victim very often had taken a long time to get enough courage to come forward, and so the victim was no longer a minor. And besides that, the statute of limitations had run out for prosecuting any such criminal activity. And so the problem for Cardinal Bernardin was, how do you deal with this? If it was still criminal, you went to the police. If it wasn't, then what do you do? Let's use an analogy. Let us say that you're a mother. You've raised 3 children, some with some difficulties, but nonetheless, you're proud of what you have done. Your husband is now ill, probably dying. And your 40-year-old daughter comes and tells you something that she had never told you before, that when she was 10 or 11, she was abused sexually by her father. What do you do? In a way, that is the kind of situation that Cardinal Bernardin was faced with an action that was clearly shameful, clearly sinful, but no longer criminal, and besides that, an action of someone who was a priest of the church, incarnated into the archdiocese, and therefore not someone you can simply dismiss. What Cardinal Bernardin did was to ask for a review, and they went through the records of 50 or 60 years, as long as some detailed records have been kept of the tens of thousands of priests who have served in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And they discovered about 1.6 of all priests who had served in the past 50 years, up to 1990, had something of this behavior in their background. Sometimes it was merely crossing of a boundary, sometimes it was genuinely horrific activity, sometimes it was serial activity. For it happens that often it isn't just one instance. If you find one, keep listening, because likely the abuser has had more than one victim. But in terms of an accuracy of terminology, I think it would be good to say that in all those records, and in their 10-year extension that we've just finished reviewing now, there was exactly one pedophile. That is, someone who sexually abused or used sexual activity to abuse a prepubescent child. That's obviously nothing to do with sex. It has everything to do with power and some kind of pathology that is extraordinarily rare in the society, which is incurable, and which means that the individual is a sociopath that simply has to be contained for the rest of his life. There was one such person in our records that we know of, and they're very, very rare in the society at large. What we're talking about, therefore, is adolescent children, minors, therefore criminal activity, but pubescent, post-pubescent. This is terrible activity. If you talk to victims, no matter that it happened to them 20, 30, 40 years ago, it's as if it happened yesterday. It always is contemporary. It stays with them even when They have kept it to themselves even when they haven't had therapy, even when they haven't had proper spiritual counseling. They remains with them in a way that, although many have managed to go on and lead good lives, nonetheless is troublesome and troubling. And these are stories that it is good to keep going back to, because otherwise we can talk in rather clinical ways and rather legal ways and forget the life that is involved here. It's not hard, if we look, to find people to talk to. The statistics for our society are, if they're accurate, and I'm not sure how you find this out, but this is what is given in the literature, 20% of young women before they were 18 were abused in some fashion, and 7 to 10% of boys before they were 18 are victims of abuse in some fashion. If those statistics are true, then this is a societal problem, but it is very much an ecclesial problem at this time, and rightly so. The society focuses on the church and says there's a particular kind of trust that has been betrayed when a priest is guilty of this sort of conduct. And that is quite true, and therefore Cardinal Bernardin, after the review, set some policies. Besides reporting immediately anything criminal, that is to protect children. And now we report everything, criminal or not, to be sure that there's at least a record in the civil society, even if the civil authorities can't prosecute because the victim is not a minor, the statute of limitations has run out. Nonetheless, we go forward with it. Even when the victims now ask us, we would rather not go to the civil authorities, we just want to be sure nobody else is ever hurt, we are no longer free not to go with every case, even if we know it's not criminal. And that is the development of the Bernardine policies, but there has been a reporting of anything that is criminal for the last 10 years, and in fact, as far as I know, before that as well. There is, however, at the same time, a report to the civil authorities goes on, an attempt through an independent review board, which was set up by Cardinal Bernardin also, and it is independent. I'm not even sure who is on it, although I know the list, and I've never met with them. They do their investigation of allegations independently, and they give me a conclusion. And the review board is supposed to tell me whether or not there is reasonable cause to believe. They're not a court, they're not a jury, they can't subpoena anything. But if there is reasonable cause to believe, then they come forth with a recommendation. In the meantime, another organization set up by Cardinal Bernardin, the Victims Assistance Ministry, sees to the therapy and the spiritual counseling that might be necessary, even if the action is 20, 30, 40 years in the past, maybe especially because these people often have had trouble keeping their lives together, keeping marriages together, being productive citizens. The Victims Assistance Ministry is, I think, one of the most successful things that was done under Cardinal Bernardin. Not always perfectly done. You can find people who say it didn't respond quickly enough or didn't respond as they would like. But if you go look at the whole history, because part of the Victims Assistance Ministry are also other victims, I think that that was a pastoral response, quite apart from a legal response, whether in church law or civil law, that was born out of the heart of a great pastor. So the protection of children in reporting and in judging the allegations. Some allegations are anonymous. There's nothing you can do if the allegation does not have a victim who is willing to come forth and say, yes, here is what happened and how it happened. But if there is a genuine allegation, then the care for the victim is primary in the protocols. And then after that, how do you attend to the perpetrators? Usually there was some kind of evaluation, sometimes therapy where appropriate. Some priests were taken out of ministry. Others were told to ask for laicization, to be out of the priesthood entirely. Some, and this was particular to Chicago as far as I know, were in ministry but as monitored and often restricted so that the safety of children would not be at issue. I inherited 8 such priests who were in monitored ministry, and in fact the monitoring was effective enough that children were safe in the sense that there have been no further accusations against them. As of yesterday, however, and this is the change from the Bernardine protocols, there is no more monitored ministry by any priest in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Of the 8 cases that were still in ministry and monitored when I came, 2 have asked to be laicized. 1 was already retired and is now withdrawn from any kind of public life as a priest, and 5 have agreed to be temporarily withdrawn from ministry while we pursue the canonical procedures that are set up, like any kind of legal procedures, to see that everyone's rights are protected. That kind of procedure we've already begun to put together, and we will continue that for the next several weeks or months until each case, each of 5 cases, and they're very different kinds of cases. We have to see that each case is handled as it is supposed to be. There are in the Archdiocese of Chicago about 940 diocesan priests and another 1,000 priests who belong to religious orders, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans. We're talking about 5 who have been temporarily withdrawn from ministry, and my purpose in withdrawing them temporarily is to observe the Dallas protocols, which say they must be permanently withdrawn. So now I have to go before some kind of process, whether it's administrative or a tribunal in the strict sense, is being worked out now, and say, I want to withdraw these men permanently from ministry. And some of them might want to laicize even though it's involuntary. Those are penalties. And if they're penalties, they have to be legally imposed, and therefore we have to go through a process. So my goal now is to see that they are permanently withdrawn from ministry. 5 of them are saying we're going to dispute that as a goal so that we can retain some sense of being priests for our own lives. We'll see how that works out. What is working out also is because of the spotlight that has been cast upon this kind of sinful and shameful behavior, and because in that spotlight several times I have asked if victims would come forward. There are new victims, or new accusers at least, against priests for the most part dead or retired. Almost all the names are of priests who were already in the review of 10 years ago, and therefore there are no great surprises. Except that there is a new victim. And again, the law that if you find one, you'll probably find more than one is proving to be true. Each of those victims now is in touch with our Victims Assistance Ministry, and we have to also try to adjudicate through the Independent Review Board whether or not there is reasonable cause to believe that this allegation is true. And so many of those allegations are now being processed. But there is a kind of a sense when you talk to a victim that, yes, this is certainly probably true. Something did happen. And so in many of these cases, I'm sure it will be found by the review board that the allegation did have happen as the victim says it did. At least there's reasonable cause. Also in the last 10 years, there have been 3 accusations of current behavior, 2 against priests who were temporarily in the Archdiocese, not priests of the Archdiocese, but working here temporarily, sent by their bishops from elsewhere to work here. And those 2 of those cases are in the hands of the police, and one turned out to be a false accusation about a month ago at St. Philomena's. But it is still the case, as it was 10 years ago when Cardinal Bernardine first introduced this, that we are talking about activity that is decades old, which is puzzling to me that isn't understood, because the letters still come in saying, why don't you just put these people in jail? You can't put them in jail. There's no crime anymore. It was criminal when it happened. It is always sinful. It is always shameful. And even forgiven sins have permanent consequences. We know that in the way Catholics approach the sacrament of penance. There's forgiveness which is offered, but there's satisfaction for sin that has to be made outside of the sacramental forum itself, usually in the form of extra prayers. Well, in a sense, that's what we're going through now. Sin certainly has been forgiven. It's no longer criminal, but it has consequences, consequences that no one would have foreseen and that are far more drastic after Dallas, for good reason, even though it is very painful. What can we say about, Tom brought up the future of the church. Well, I don't know. That's not in my hands. It's in Christ's hands. It's his body. We're his people. The church, hopefully, will be purified through this. If there is any hubris attached to the exercise of ordained priesthood in the church, hopefully that will be gone also. And there undoubtedly has been that at times. If priests thought of themselves as a caste somehow not only above civil law, but also above moral law in a few cases, then certainly I think that will change, and I hope it does, and there will be genuine conversion to Christ and to service of Christ in his people. The church's moral voice is necessarily weakened in the midst of this kind of crisis. Also, our institutional fabric may or may not be weakened. All those things I mentioned when I started out, talking about education and housing and social services. We'll see how that plays out. But finally, in the last analysis, as I said earlier, people come to church in order to know Jesus Christ as he wants to be known and to be loved and to be touched by him through the sacraments, which are the actions of the risen Christ in our space and in our time. Our future, therefore, is in Christ's hands, and if the church is a little less a provider of services and a little more a school of discipleship, that will be all to the good. Thank you very much.
We are on TV. The City Club of Chicago has a access television network that will present this on Saturday, June 29 at 7 p.m. CAN TV 21. If you have questions, please approach the microphone there. I have a question for you, Your Eminence. But you knew I would, wouldn't you?
Always. Usually not a question, but a pronouncement.
Yeah, that's right. Pontifical. What's being done about the seminaries to ventilate that policy or look at candidates who approach it? Is there a don't ask, don't tell thing regarding homosexuality? That seems to be, according to some writers, the central problem of this crisis we're in, as well as the seminaries. Would you please address it, sir?
Well, when you have a crisis like this, the responses to solving it bring out a lot of a agenda that may or may not be directly related to it, but is certainly indirectly. The question about seminaries is direct, because you can ask what happened in the seminaries that either priests with this kind of proclivity weren't weeded out, men weren't weeded out before they were ordained, or at least they weren't instructed adequately to understand what their obligations are. Because the bishops, prodded by the Holy See before I became a bishop in the middle 80s, wanted to reform the seminaries, there was a review of seminary activity, and it seems to me, looking at the history, even though I wasn't in the country at the time, it had an enormous effect upon them. In the 70s, there were activities and instruction, teaching in the seminaries that wasn't always what the church herself mandated to be there. In the mid-80s, there was a reform. The teaching is much more strictly attended to, and likewise the training for how to live as a good priest is much more exigent. And the fact that we haven't had cases against priests who are 10, 12 years ordained, maybe they will come, we'll see, in the next 20 years. But the fact that we haven't, I think, says something about the reform in the seminaries that has already taken place. Also, in reaction to this scandal, when I talked to the priests in various fora, the ones who are 25, 30 years ordained are much more affected, because they grew up when there was a certain respect for the priesthood, and they are accustomed to that, and now they are themselves ashamed because of the actions of their brothers. And the sin of one affects us all, just as the virtue of one affects us all. So we take pride in our heroes, and we take shame from our sinners. But it's affected far more those who are already 25 or 30 years ordained. It seems to me, when I talk to those ordained less than 10 years, a number have said, Cardinal, we were in the seminary when Cardinal Bernardine was accused. This has been part of our experience as seminarians and priests all our lives. We'll get through it. And there seems to be a better grounding in some ways for recognizing the societal shift and change that is focused now in the church, but is also quite general. So I think that the seminaries have changed, and to say that they haven't is, I think, not entirely responsible. And it would be good to go back to the seminaries themselves and not just talk to men who have been kicked out of seminaries and therefore are unhappy campers, to find out what in fact is going on. However, every dimension has to be looked at. The present discipline of the Latin Church in the Catholic Church, the Latin churches, is that we call to ordained priesthood only those who have the personal grace to be celibate. That has a long history. It goes back to immediately post-apostolic times. It became the discipline of the church right after the end of public persecution, when the Church of Virgins and Martyrs began to organize herself in a more regular way. It was clearly imposed in northern Africa, in all of the Iberian Peninsula, and it became universal in the West into the Gregorian forms of the 8th or 9th century. There's a reason for it. Christ was celibate. And someone who is to represent Christ as head of his church and to love the people as Christ loves him is very appropriately married only to the church and not to anyone else. And so in the Orthodox churches, which are also apostolic, the bishop cannot be married. In the Western and Latin churches, the bishop cannot be married, and neither can ordained priests, for the most part. The discipline has always been that a married man can be ordained, but an ordained man cannot be married. And if a man who is ordained is already married, most often he had to separate from his wife. His children were already grown, and so he did not live as a married man. He lived as a celibate man. That's the history. And there's a good reason for it, a spiritual reason for it. And if we would leave that discipline, something of apostolic times would be gone. Nonetheless, it is a discipline, and it can be discussed, particularly in a post-Freudian culture that doesn't understand the witness of celibacy and that says that you can't really be adult, you can't be a true human being if you are not involved in some kind of sexual relationship. So we have that kind of culture, and the celibacy witness is not understood. Maybe for that reason it's more necessary than ever. But that's an open question, and it has been discussed. I've discussed it even in Rome, not so much about our kind of culture, which prizes sexual relations just because of intimacy, but in regard to other cultures, tribal cultures, particularly in the Canadian North and in parts of Africa, where celibacy is in ill repute because a man has to have children or else he's not a man. And so it's a question of children in those cultures that is necessary, not so much intimacy. But nonetheless, those discussions go on. And I think, however, the training to live as celibate disciples of the Lord in such a way that you have a kind of a freedom, interior as well as in time, to be entirely at the disposition of the church is appropriate. And we're not going to change that this week or next week, but the discussion goes on. Regarding, so for some people, celibacy is the cause. But of course, if celibacy were the cause, then you wouldn't have the 95% of sexual abuse by married men. So that's not exactly the cause, although it does enter into the pool that you call people from. It also enters into psychological development. If a man is not sexually adult, if he's remained an infant at 40 years old and he's trying to find himself, you're in deep, deep trouble. And so there's a lot more attention paid now than was 20 years ago, even when I went through the seminary 30 years ago, to psychosexual development. And explicit questions are raised, tests are given, etc., and that is worked out one by one so that we ordain people who can live as chaste men vowed to celibacy for the sake of the church. Do we also ordain a higher proportion of homosexual men than you would find in the general culture? Well, it's hard to know what the general culture is. The Kinsey studies talk about 10 to 15%. More sober researchers talk about 1 to 3% are homosexual. When you look at the Catholic priesthood, I've seen statistics from 10% to 80%. Those aren't exactly hard statistics. So we don't know for sure what we're dealing with, although we can, kind of figure out, as you do sometimes, well, what is his biological orientation? The question in terms of ordaining a man a Catholic priest isn't so much the biological orientation, it's a question of can he assume the identity of priest? And the identity of an ordained priest is someone who is married. He's not an ecclesiastical bachelor. He's married to the church, as Christ is married to the church. He's not a free agent. He's not looking for a partner. He's not supposed to be. And therefore, he is set in a stable way of discipleship. If, in fact, the identity is that you are a father, you have spiritual children, and you're a husband, you're married to the church, what do you do with that identity if you're homosexually oriented? The fact that you have a biological orientation in one way, does that automatically mean that you cannot assume a spiritual identity which is bound up with paternity? You have to talk to people who are far more aware of the inner dynamics of a homosexual personality than I am. But you have to address it, I think, in those terms. What is the identity you're asking this man to take on, and can he live it? And I think those are the terms that are now being used. I don't believe that there are now, certainly not in the seminary that I'm responsible for, anything there is now, anything that looks like a gay subculture. If that happens, if there's a tipping point where you suddenly get a significant number of homosexually oriented candidates, and there is a kind of an openness, even if it's not open promiscuity, but an openness to this way of life, then you're in deep, deep difficulty. And so what Tom said about addressing this is something that we're going to bring into our investigation of the seminaries as we go forward. But I think that's the way I see it. And I don't believe that in that general analysis, I'm far from the facts as they are.
Thank you. Question, please?
Oh, we're doing it in this order. Okay. I'm going to change the subject then and go to something that you actually might have wanted to talk about.
Thank you very
because
much.
I'm sitting next to Sister Carol Big Shoulders Fund. I'd like to know what you see the future of Catholic education in the city of Chicago.
Well, let me quote what I was going to quote. We have 267 elementary schools with 96,300 students, 45 secondary or high schools with 31,400 schools. Of those, about 100, a little more than 100, are big shoulder schools because they serve in very poor areas, whether in this city or in Waukegan. The future depends upon whether or not there is money to keep them going. Poverty closes schools, and uncertainty closes schools. Sometimes a parent won't bring a child to a school because they're not sure whether it's going to be there or not. We closed 16 schools this year. When I got here 5 years ago, I was given a report saying you have to close 45 schools or else the diocese will go bankrupt. Because what happens in those cases, very often they are in African and American neighborhoods where the parish community is rather small, the school community is largely non-Catholic. Some of our schools are 80% non-Catholic. So the traditional relationship between parish and school, namely the parish makes up the deficit of the school, wasn't possible because the parish is too small and the parish community is not the school community. So those are the places where you had to subsidize. The subsidizations began under Cardinal Cody, who was very sensitive to race relations, and that began on a very small scale, and now it's a huge scale. It was 14 million at one point when I first came. We've got it down to 6 million, and we're committed as an archdiocese to keeping it at 6 million. Big Shoulders will subsidize another 2.5 to 3 million, plus give special grants. And in that way, I think we're down to the point now, after the last closings, which don't amount to 45, and I hope they won't, to a framework which enables us to keep Cardinal Bernardine's promise to make Catholic education affordable and available throughout the archdiocese. And if we can sustain the network that we have now, and I hope we can, basically, then we'll be all right. We're also opening Catholic schools, but largely in parishes that can afford them, in the suburbs and in other parishes. They're expanding, it's growing. But our primary concern is among the poorer people, how to keep that education available and at formation, which is one of the big reasons why parents send their kids to a Catholic school, even if they're not Catholic.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Jewish and I went to a Catholic college,
Good for you.
Manhattanville, the Sacred Heart. Yeah.
So later, the religious Sacred Heart. Very good. Thank you very much. So with your help, we can keep it going, and the commitment is there. I sincerely hope it's possible.
Your Eminence, I'm Joyce Saxon. I'm on the board of City Club and a practicing Catholic, and I have a lighter question also.
No,
I hope your answer is yes. Have you reconsidered selling your beautiful, what I was raised, I live 4 blocks from you, as a Cardinal's Palace to another developer who's going to build another high-rise to obscure our view of the lake? I mean, I remember when they built a ramp for President Roosevelt to come and see the Archbishop of Chicago.
Yes.
Have you reconsidered this?
I wish I could say yes, and then you'd be, but I first of all, it's not mine to reconsider at this point. I have 4. Everybody imagines that the Archbishop can do anything he wants. That's what I was told when I first came. Well, you're the Archbishop of Chicago. You can do whatever you want. But here's how we do it in Chicago. And but even canonically, I have 4 groups that I have to go to. They can't force me to do something, but they can stop me from doing something. And, I mean, the job of a bishop is to be a symbol of unity. And so you'd better keep listening to be sure that at least you know how the unity is going to be fractured by something that you do. You may do it anyway, but you better do it only for principle and not because it's your own desire. My desire to put that question on the table, well, if you'll permit a joke. This is just a joke, please. Sometimes I get in trouble when I tell jokes. But last summer, you recall, we had some trouble with obedience, and right now we're having terrible problems with chastity, so I thought I'd try poverty for a change. Anyway, but my purpose was to ask in the moment, because the church will be different in the future from what she has been in the past. She always is. What is the image that you want the Archbishop to have? And if it's an image that's involved with wealth and with clout and with whatever, which might have served an immigrant community very well to say, here we are, maybe we're in a transition. And so a house isn't just a place to live. If you want to ask how it is to live there, I'd be happy to tell you. It's a lot. Anyway, but it's a nice neighborhood. It's a marvelous neighborhood. The house was built in 1882 without bathrooms, so you figure it out. Anyway, I mean, I have to be totally given to my task as Archbishop, and anything gets in the way is not useful. So we have to ask, what image do we want to have for the Archbishop of Chicago? And I have to consult the Catholic community, and the mail is running 8-1 in your favor right now, and have to consult all these groups. But that was the purpose of it. I was calling newly ordained priests. We ordained 11, we'll ordain 2 more this year, with the largest class coming into Mundelein that we've had in the last 30 years, 31. We had the largest class we ever had, 26 last year, that has come in for a long time. So we're going to be ordaining more priests. And I'm calling them to a life of discipleship, and therefore to humility and embracing a suffering Christ as their shepherd. What does that say if I'm calling them to that and I'm living in that house, which doesn't exactly talk about humility and the sufferings of Christ? So if people want me to stay there, I'll stay there. But I think we ought to at least talk about it and say, what does it mean? That's the whole purpose. What it would become after, well, you don't think all those folks around there are going to let that be torn down and a new high-rise brought up, do you? I mean, that will be the real estate battle of the century. And I've talked to a few developers about it already. But, and you know, that's the purpose. That's the purpose. What do you want as a practicing Catholic, your Archbishop, to be saying? And where I live says something.
Please go back to obedience. It'd be like selling the White House.
Thank you very much. Please go back to obedience.
Yeah.
Your Eminence, I have a real light question to ask, something I've been wondering ever since John Cardinal Cody. No other Catholic has been able to answer the question to me satisfactorily, and I was wondering, why is the Cardinal in between Francis and George and not at the beginning?
Well, because, you know, a cardinal means you're a member of the clergy of Rome. And so every cardinal has a parish in Rome where he's honorary pastor. And while I'm the Archbishop of Chicago, I'm also a member of the Roman clergy, which gives me the right to elect the Bishop of Rome when the Pope dies. So that's what that's all about. And there were cardinal deacons, cardinal priests, cardinal bishops, that is, the surrounding areas. They grew up and they were always resident in Rome until about the 9th or 10th century, when the Pope started to name the Archbishop of Paris and a few other folks cardinals as a kind of a personal honor. But they were cardinals because they have a Roman title. So I am a cardinal priest of the Holy Roman Church with the title of St. Bartholomew on the Tiber Island. That's my church in Rome. I can't do anything there. If I show up and interfere, I'm in deep trouble. But nonetheless, that's my title. So, but a lot of those folks were also from the nobility. So just as you say Elizabeth, Queen of England, so you say Francis, Cardinal of the George family. Now, my family's not noble, and that's a rather ridiculous conceit. So a lot of us just use Cardinal Francis George, or Cardinal whatever, that depends. But formally it is still, because it comes out of that practice of naming people who were of the nobility to that kind of cardinalatial honor, it goes Francis. That's why in the Mass we say our Bishop Francis. You use the first name all the time. And then the rest is your title. But here, we you know, in this kind of society, more of us are switching back to the less formal way of going at it. I don't know if that's the reason. I hope that's clear. Yes.
Yes, Your Eminence, Maureen Murphy. I first of all want to applaud you on your forthrightness on all life issues and on any of these contentious issues. It's a sign of true leadership that we are needing now. Relative to old crime that may have escaped the statute of limitations, as a mother and a Catholic all my life, I'd like to know and have a sense of confidence that we are or have, either past tense, currently, or future, will be rooting out predators of either stripe. And perhaps we don't have to out people and their names, but say, you know, X number of priests apply for the job, and only X number get it, just like when police departments have psychologicals. Now, for the good priests, every good priest that we know that now goes through this ritualistic changing of the guard of parishes, I fear there might be some suspicions. Is there anything that we can re-examine, whether this policy of rotating priests, good priests, not about recycling priests that were of suspicion? Has it been helping? Or, you know, every priest that gets transferred the next year, the parishioners are wondering, why is he going somewhere?
Well, no, we transfer about 50 priests, 60 priests a year.
Are we going to continue with that?
Of
And
course,
does it help
at
our
least right now, yeah.
cause?
There was no one in ministry now in the Archdiocese of Chicago that I know of who has this in his background. As of yesterday, there were 8 monitored men who have just been taken out. So not all of them are out of priesthood, but they're all out of ministry, and they'll be permanently out of ministry and out of any kind of public ability to use your collar as a passport, as the victim groups say, which is true. So that they won't be able to present themselves as priests, they won't be able to call father, etc. Some of them will ask for laicization, some of them might be involuntarily laicized. That's a new possibility that came out of the Roman meeting a month and a half ago. But at any rate, as far as I know right now, there's no one among the diocesan priests, at least in ministry, who has any of this in his background. Now, as new allegations come forward, we keep the process going, and the Dallas protocols say that you cannot be in any kind of public ministry, and probably not in the priesthood, depending upon your age and infirmity and the rest. In terms of rotating priests, we have the local policy, which is diocesan law, of 2 6-year terms for a pastor. And the priests themselves, again and again, have said that's the policy, even though it's hard to leave, that we want to have. Because the Archdiocesan Pastoral Council, the lay people, when I go to them and when I go to the Women's Commission, they say it's a good policy because after 12 years, no matter how good a pastor he has been, he has his own leadership group. And when we get somebody else, there will be a changing of the guard, and we think that's healthier. And the priests themselves, even though it's hard, particularly in your late 50s, when you're grown to love a group, to be picked up and put someplace else, know, if you talk to most of them, it was good for me. It was a good transition. So we're going to continue that until the local law changes, and we can keep looking at that if you'd suggest a change. However, that would have other repercussions. We used to have pastors for life. The parish that I grew up in, St. Pascal, was founded by a man named George Heimsoth, and he died as pastor 45 years later. There are certain advantages to that. He's a true father to that neighborhood. But there are disadvantages also in the kind of society which is quite mobile that we have begun. And so the policy of having term limits is a good one, and I don't think we're going to change it tomorrow. But if you want to write me and say why you think we should change it, I'd bring that to the Presbyterial Council and to the Archdiocesan Pastoral Council and ask their advice.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cardinal, the bishops, the cardinals have been summoned to Rome, and the bishops have met in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the next step?
The next step we just took yesterday. The Dallas protocols are now particular law for the Archdiocese of Chicago, and we move on that. There are a few other cases that have to be looked at of men already retired out of any kind of ministry, but who are still presenting themselves publicly, have that right. As priests, we have to look at those 4 or 5. So I think we have to stay very close to the policies, but then we have to restore a sense of our being a people who believe that God is love, and that God's love is called mercy. Mercy is love that's very quick to forgive. Not to ignore the consequences, but to forgive. When we were talking about the sacrament of penance and its administration in the Archdiocese in a meeting a couple weeks ago, one of the diocesan priests told me, he said, our problem isn't so much that people have lost the sense of sin. We have a big sense of sin, only now people kind of boast of it in Geraldo and in all those, But we have a sense of sin. we don't have a sense of forgiveness. I think that reflects also in the debate on the death penalty. I think it reflects also in the debates going on now. I think that the church is supposed to be someone who's now hampered in doing this because she can't be looking like she's covering up or not listening to the victims of sin, but has to continue to proclaim a gospel of forgiveness. If we don't do that, there's no future at all. We've betrayed the mission that Christ has given us. So I think the future is to help people to understand what it means to forgive, not to put aside the consequences of sin, but to forgive and to unite and to allow Christ to heal us and then go on. And we'll go on in the way the church has always gone on. I don't have a huge plan for the future. I don't have to have a plan for the future. Christ has some sense of what he wants us to do. He's given us a mission. I have to see that the people stay together in the mission that Christ wants us to have. I'll do that. And then you and others, come forward with what the Holy Spirit is telling you, and we'll try to keep it together and move forward. So I don't think I have to have a huge plan for the future. Just have confidence that Christ remains with his people, and that's my job to keep them together visibly in Christ.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeff Berkowitz, head of JB Consulting Group, and also host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night at 8:30 on Channel 21.
Thank you.
Warning, this is not softball. Let's play a little hardball. One thing I don't think you've dealt with this afternoon, which would be the analogy to the public school situation or private school, where a principal has knowingly transferred a teacher who had been engaged in abuse, sexual abuse of either pre or post-pubescent minors, to another school, another area, or a superintendent. As I understand it, if that had happened...
Is this going to be a question, Mr.
This is the question. In that case, the principal, I think, would be subject to civil criminal liability and probably discharged. So in this case, should bishops who were involved in analogous activity be treated any differently? What is your view? Specifically, you might address if what is said about cardinal law is true, what should be done about that, but also hypothetically about bishops in general who've engaged in that kind of management behavior.
Depends, in a sense, again, how they did it. I think the protocols for Chicago and monitoring were responsibly put together, but they're not possible now. And you have to look back also at sometimes the advice from the psychologists changed in the middle 80s. Before that, they used to say this man is safe for ministry, and now they won't give you that guarantee at all. So some of those judgments were bad judgments made with advice that in hindsight is absolutely wrong. Nonetheless, there's responsibility for that, and particularly because somebody was hurt after, and there's no excuse for that. What the bishops did was two things that were unprecedented: to supervise the implementation of the Dallas policies in every diocese, and therefore to supervise the bishop's oversight of that in his ministry. There is now a lay board under Governor Keating, which is being put together by Bishop Wilton Gregory, who's the president of the conference. And they've never before opened their ministry to that kind of oversight by a national board. Likewise, there was a second resolution, not very much publicized, that the bishops put forward so that they would supervise one another's ministry. Right now, the only superior of a bishop is the Pope. That's all. I'm not the superior of any other bishop. Each bishop is bishop in his own diocese. So our sense of collective responsibility for this and collective shame at what has happened has prompted us to put in the hands, through a resolution passed in Dallas, of a standing committee of the conference on bishops' life and ministry, a resolution that's saying we feel we're collectively responsible now for one another's ministry, and we have to examine what happened and to see how we are collectively responsible. And so now we're beginning to move towards oversight of one another. That had never happened either. What that comes to in the future, we'll find out, but that's where we are right now. Something such as a sanction for a bishop who has done something like that is on the table now. It was never on the table before. We'll see what happens next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Ann Scheidler. Your Eminence, you mentioned the false accusation against Cardinal Bernardine and a recent false accusation against a priest here
A
in the
Columban
diocese.
Father, St. Philomenas, yeah.
When a false accusation is made, is there anything out of the Dallas Protocol that will help to restore a priest's reputation if an accusation
Yeah.
is made against him? And
At the end of the protocols that talk about withdrawing from ministry, certainly, and in a permanent way, and perhaps also withdrawing from priesthood, depending upon his age and infirmity, there is then a final statement that says, if in fact the allegation has been false, the bishop will do everything he can to restore his endangered reputation.
And is
But,
there any sort of recompense for the person who brought a false accusation?
Well, no. I mean, sometimes it's genuine. Sometimes people's, like in the most recent case, St. Philomena's, the little girl, I think, obviously felt that there was a crossing of boundaries. When the police investigated, they said there really wasn't anything objectively, but she felt that, and that's important. So what would you do in that case? I don't, no, we didn't ask that, and I'm not sure whether we should. The important thing is to try to restore a reputation if it has been unfairly damaged. All of us have only a reputation. That's all we have. Cardinal Dulles was made cardinal a couple of years ago. I was kidding him recently when I saw him, Avery Dulles, the theologian from New York, who's a wonderful man, not a bishop, but a cardinal. And I said, Avery, cardinals had good reputations until about the time you became a cardinal. And personally, I'd rather have a good reputation than be a cardinal. And I think most of us would say that. So all of us at the end have just our reputations. And now I know a lot of priests do feel that they're sitting ducks, that anything, no matter how kind of strange it might seem, has to be given credibility and has to be investigated. But that leaves priests feeling very vulnerable, and also it puts some kind of pall over our relationships at times. You have to be very careful. But that's the price we all pay for sin. There's not collective guilt, but there are collective consequences to sin. And so we have to go through this, and it's good, it's a purification. Hopefully, as this happens, if there is a false accusation, and you have to be very careful before you say that, because the person bringing it forward doesn't usually bring it forward lightly, then we'll do what we can to restore our reputation.
Thank you.
Thank you.